All right. Welcome to our podcast on Kingdom Protista. And in this podcast, we are just going to go over some of the basic characteristics. We're going to have several labs on these. So we'll just get started right away, jump right in. Okay? Kingdom Protista, you already know some of the basics about it. First of all, they are all eukaryotic, and in fact, that is one of the few things that all protists have in common. They are all eukaryotic organisms. Um, there we go. We already know that there's a lot of variety in here because it's kind of the junk drawer of classification. Some are single-celled, like Paramecia. Some are multicellular, like this kelp that we're seeing here. Some are heterotrophic, some are autotrophic. Some, all of them are much more complex than any prokaryote, or as you may better know them as bacteria. All are much more complex than any bacteria, however. Okay? And of course, as we've already mentioned, this is the most diverse of the six kingdoms because it has so many different kinds of organisms in it, and many of them need to not be in this kingdom. They are poorly classified, and so the story of the kingdom of Protista today is pretty much how scientists are taking things out of Kingdom Protista and putting into different kingdoms or creating new kingdoms for them or whatever. All right. Now, we are going to take Kingdom Protista and divide it into three main groups. Please understand these are not true taxonomic categories like phylum or class or order or whatever. These are groups that we are using solely to make things easier for us. And in a way, this is an oversimplification of this kingdom, but it's a way that helps us deal with it at this level of your education. So, there are three main groups. There are animal-like protists, plant-like protists, and fungus-like protists. In other words, these things seem like they should fall into one of those categories, but they don't quite make it because they don't possess some characteristic that a true animal, plant, or fungus would have. Okay? Now, within these three subgroups, often protists are grouped according to how they move around. Okay? Remember, this kingdom is not well designed, so these are kind of just conventions that make it easier for us to talk about them. Please do remember them, as this is the dumping ground kingdom. Okay? It is currently being reworked today and will probably be divided into many kingdoms that more accurately reflect real evolutionary relationships. Indeed, that's being done right now. If you look at this classification, phylogeny, a phylogeny is another name for a family tree. Of all the eukaryotic organisms, these are all representing kingdoms that they think they are going to end up dividing Protista into. So look at all these kingdoms that they think really exist within the protists that are really so different from each other they can't even be put in the same kingdom. So it's quite a mess. All right. All right. The first thing we're going to do then is look at the animal-like protists. Collectively, this group is called the protozoans. These are the animal-like protists. Okay? Protozoan is not a plant-like protist, it's an animal-like protist. Now, this group of protists does have something in common. They are all unicellular, one-celled organisms. All of them, since they are animal-like, lack cell walls. Okay? They are all, since they're animal-like, heterotrophs. Okay? They are all, well, we know what heterotrophs mean. Some of them are ingester digesters. As we've talked about before, they take something into their mouth and then break it down inside their body. That's what we do. Many are, in fact, decomposers. Okay? Oh boy, hold on. Okay, so we have both types of heterotrophs represented here. All right. There are a few phyla, so kingdom, phylum. There are a few phyla of protozoans that we're going to talk about. The first one of these is phylum Sarcodina. These are protozoans that move using pseudopods. And basically what this means is this protozoan is a single cell and it's a blob of cytoplasm, but it's kind of literally like the blob. It can ooze out part of its body and wrap around something, and so extensions of cell membrane that contain cytoplasm are called pseudopods. Pod means foot, pseudo means fault, so false foot. Okay? These pseudopods can help it creep along, they can help it capture food. The classic example of this organism is an amoeba, and there are many different types of amoeba. Amoeba lack cell walls, they move with pseudopods, they will engulf bits of food. If this is an amoeba, a bit of food would be right here and it would engulf it. Its pseudopods would extend out and just engulf that food item, and then it would digest it. Okay? All right. The food item would be broken down by a lysosome. It would be captured inside a food vacuole. So this would be like the food vacuole that contains the food item. And then a lysosome containing digestive enzymes would come up and fuse with that vacuole and digest the food item. They reproduce by asexual reproduction only. So essentially mitosis. These guys can do mitosis because they have chromosomes and a nucleus, like we've talked about. They do cause disease. Many of them do not, but amoebic dysentery is a fairly well-known disease. It's a horrible type of diarrhea, basically, that is found usually when there's not very sanitary conditions. Some amoeba actually have shells. Amoeba that have, remember, this is a single-celled organism, so this little single cell has a little shell around it. Foraminiferans are one type, and the shell is made of calcium carbonate, much like any shell you would find on the beach. There are also radiolarians, where their shells are made out of silica, which is basically the same mineral sand is made out of. And they're really strikingly pretty if you look at them under a microscope. You would find amoeba in both saltwater, marine, or freshwater habitats. Okay? Now, you ought to remember that freshwater amoeba do tend to take in excess water due to osmosis. Remember, if an amoeba is in water, the concentration of water outside is going to be high, the concentration inside is low, and so water would flow in, and since this thing has no cell wall, it could burst. There has to be some way to deal with that. So they do have structures called contractile vacuoles, which act as pumps that will pump water out of the cell, and so we see them here in some other protists as well. Okay? So this is a photo of an amoeba under a microscope, and these structures, all of these structures that are like that, and certainly over here like that, these are all pseudopods. So if a food item was right here, his pseudopods could enclose around it and capture it. Okay, we'll look at these in class, so I won't bother you with these here. That's a picture of the radiolarians with their shells, the shells of the radiolarians, so again made out of silica, which is very pretty. All right, the next phylum we're going to talk about for protozoans are the Zoomastigina. Okay, and this group moves with flagella. Remember, we're organizing these animal-like protists based on how they move. What you see here is human blood. Okay, these are red blood cells. These are white blood cells, I believe. And what you see here is not supposed to be there. It is one of these protists with flagella. They are acting as parasites, in this case living in a person's bloodstream. So some of these are not parasitic. Some are perfectly helpful to the environment, whatever. But some are parasites, and that's what we're seeing in this image. They are called trypanosomes. Okay, and this is an electron micrograph of them right here, and of course the yellow is the parasite and the red is the blood cell. They cause a disease called African sleeping sickness, which actually requires two hosts, a human for these things to live in the human's blood, but also another host called a tsetse fly, and that's a picture of a tsetse fly. And so a tsetse fly would bite a human, get the parasite, and then go take it to another human. And so you have this life cycle between two hosts. Okay? African sleeping sickness, though it sounds like you just get sleepy, it can be fatal, and so that's that. All right, the next phylum of animal-like protists is phylum Ciliaphora rather, or the ciliates, and these guys move with cilia. Now cilia are hair like. They are not hair, okay? So let's just make sure we know that right away. They cover the body of the little single-celled critter, and they beat in rhythm and thus help propel the little critter through water. This group has some of the most complex protozoans in it. They are found in aquatic habitats all over. They do have not a cell wall, but a protein that covers them, and it's called a pellicle. It's not a true cell wall, but it has flexibility, and it does offer some protection. They usually reproduce asexually, but they can undergo something called conjugation, which sounds like something we learned about with the bacteria. It is... I should have written here, this is not sexual reproduction. It is not sex. It is just an exchange of a few genes in something called a micronucleus. They have two nuclei, a macronucleus and a micronucleus. Well, they exchange the small one when they are doing conjugation. It's not sex. It's not sex as mom gives half the genes, dad gives half the genes into this new offspring. This is not that. This is just kind of an exchange between a couple of ciliates. Okay? There's the micro and macro right there. So your big example would be a paramecium. We'll do a lab with paramecium later on. If you were looking at a paramecium, this is obviously the electron micrograph or a light microscope view of one. This is showing you a diagram form. This is showing right here its mouth-like structure. This is called the oral groove. And if there was a food item, some food here, he'd slide up next to the food, and the food would go in here into his gullet, which is kind of like a throat, but remember this is a one-celled organism. And then the food would go into a food vacuole. A lysosome would fuse with the food vacuole and digest the food. Anything that could not be digested would be released through a structure called an anal pore, which is right there. Okay, so they also have contractile vacuoles, which you can see here, this kind of star-shaped thing. And these are the large and small, or macro and micronuclei. Okay? This is just an image showing conjugation where they would look like they're having sex, but they're really not. They're just exchanging a micronucleus. Okay? And we'll worry about the videos in class, so we can skip those. There are other ciliates. This one doesn't even move around. You can see this one's kind of implanted, but it's not a plant. It's an animal-like protist, but its cilia beat, and this thing is shaped a bit like a funnel, and so these little food particles would be drawn in by the currents that the beating cilia make and be drawn into its little funnel where they would be digested. It's called stentor, but it's also a ciliate. All right, finally, the last animal-like protist is, that we will talk about is from phylum Sporozoa. And if animal-like protists are classified according to how they move, these don't move, at least not on their own. They can, of course, be carried, but they cannot move on their own. All of them are parasites. Every last one. There's none of these that some of them live on their own. All sporozoa are parasites. And here again we see red blood cells, and we see a nasty infection in which red blood cells have been occupied by the parasite here, a sporozoan, and they are burst, and the parasite is getting ready to come out to infect some more cells. So non-motile, many of them produce reproductive structures called spores, and they have extremely complex life cycles, and again, they require host organisms and often two hosts. The most famous one in this group is Plasmodium, is the name of the animal-like protist. The disease it causes is malaria. So the two hosts are a human and a mosquito. Okay, so the mosquito would bite an infected human, get the parasite in its body, and then when it bit another human, it could pass the parasite to them. So mosquitoes are the vectors for this. Okay, and malaria is a very, very serious illness. We don't need to go into detail on that. All right, I'm going to stop there and take a break so that you can take a break, and then if you want to tune back in again, we will do the algae. Okay, thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.